It was just past midnight on October 17, 2025, when the sky above western Crimea ignited in a way that would be replayed in newsrooms and war rooms around the world. In Saki and the surrounding towns, residents were jolted awake by two searing fireballs that carved bright trails across the darkness. The first visible signatures of an operation months in the planning. For ordinary people, it was terror and bewilderment. For military planners and intelligence analysts, it was the opening chord of a meticulously composed symphony of asymmetric warfare. The explosions over Saki airfield were not random. They were a designed signal, a beginning. From hidden command posts across Ukraine, operators watched telemetry and feeds as over 60 unmanned systems and missiles launched into the night. A mixed bouquet of cheap decoys and precision strike platforms meant to overwhelm, confuse, and above all, to reveal. Ukraine's designers had thought in systems. They understood that a modern air defense network is not just missiles and radars, but a complicated organism of detection, tracking, command and control, and human decision-making. So they fed that organism contradictions. Waves of cheap radar-catching flyers that forced expensive interceptors to burn through stocks of missiles and reveal the critical coordinates of radar arrays. Electronic feints designed to elicit predictable reactions. And, woven through it all, a handful of fast, smart strike drones built to exploit every gap and seam. When Russia's S-400s, Pantsir-S1s, and Tor M1s awoke and lit the night with tracer arcs and launch flashes, they were doing exactly what Ukraine needed them to do. Every interceptor fired, every radar turned, was a teaching moment for Kyiv's analysts. The more the Russians defended, the more they exposed. The decoys did their job brilliantly. On screen after screen, operators saw false tracks blossom like mushrooms. Dozens of targets that looked convincing enough to mask the real threats. Military commentators would later call this the economics of attrition. A $10,000 drone forcing the enemy to launch a $2 to $4 million interceptor. But the financial math was only the surface story. The real victory was informational. Radar signatures, jamming frequencies, reaction times, the choreography of human operators under stress. All were cataloged and fed into subsequent attack cycles. While Russian crews rushed to meet visible threats, Ukraine's low-altitude attackers navigated the shadows, using terrain masking and inertial navigation to slip below detection horizons when GPS was denied. Among those low-flying killers were systems colloquially known as Peklo and Bober, modular, hardened, and designed for surgical destruction. These drones were engineered to be survivable in contested electromagnetic environments. When jammers tried to blind them, they switched to inertial and pre-programmed terminal guidance. When radar cones rotated, they exploited gaps, timing their approach to coincide with moments when sensors were saturated or reload cycles created blind windows. Their strikes were not about theatrical devastation so much as calibrated effects. Hit the rail junction and sever a trunk of logistics. Hit the ammunition dump and cause cascading detonations that multiply damage far beyond the initial blast. Hit the fuel terminal and choke the lifeline of forward deployments. The night's crescendo came at the Feodosia Maritime Oil Terminal, a sprawling cluster of storage tanks that anchored Russia's southern fuel network. Kyiv's planners had long recognized that strategic sustainment is often less glamorous than battlefield heroics, but equally decisive. Destroy the fuel nodes and vehicles stand idle. Planes and ships find less juice. Supply convoys become a series of risk calculations rather than routine maneuvers. At roughly 1:47 a.m. local time on October 17th, the terminal's skyline bloomed into towering infernos as multiple tanks ruptured under precise strikes. The towering flames and black smoke were visible on satellite passes and in amateur footage streaming through social platforms. Within minutes, the terminal had ceased to function as a logistics hub, not because of a single missile, but because the attack turned the complex into a dangerously unstable hazard zone. In the immediate aftermath, Russian statements insisted a high percentage of intruders had been intercepted. Official lines emphasized defensive competence and downplayed loss. But the physical evidence, scorched tank farms, severed railway arteries, and ruined depots, told a different tale. Images and open-source geolocation revealed not only destruction, but effective targeting. Ammunition bunkers that had been stocked for months detonated in chain reactions. Key nodes in the rail network were blasted apart. Storage areas essential to sustainment were rendered unusable. The veneer of invulnerability around Crimea had been punctured, and the blow resonated strategically far beyond the peninsula's coastline. This event was, on one level, the bloom of a tactical idea using numbers, cheapness, and deception to break a more expensive, hardware-heavy defense. But its significance ran deeper. It marked the maturing of a doctrine that had been gestating for years. A doctrine that fused intelligence, deception, electronic warfare, and unmanned lethality into a coherent, affordable operational system. The attack showcased how a resource-constrained actor could impose disproportionate effects on a peer equipped with top-tier air defenses. For militaries and analysts around the globe, the lesson was sobering. In a connected battle space, intelligence and adaptability can be equalizers. There were also human costs folded inside this technical narrative. Civilians near Feodosia faced rushed evacuations in the pre-dawn chaos. Smoke-choked neighborhoods saw utilities disrupted as pumps and pipelines succumbed to blast and fire. Local hospitals prepared for burn and blast casualties, even as emergency responders navigated unexploded ordnance and ruptured infrastructure. Beyond immediate suffering, there were second-order effects. Interrupted fuel deliveries that would ripple into food logistics, increased operational risk for occupying forces, and the psychological toll of a population that had been told for years that annexation brought security. The night changed perceptions, in local minds, in Moscow, and in capitals watching the conflict. On a macro level, the attack struck at the economics of modern war. Each Russian interceptor that rose into the night expended not only a missile, but a supply chain node. Replacement rounds, maintenance cycles, and the industrial base behind each launcher. Ukraine's attritional calculus was shrewd. Expend modest sums on a handful of effective drones and dozens of decoys to bleed out the opponent's expensive consumables. This was not trickery for its own sake. It was a financial strategy as much as a military one. Over time, such a dynamic can tilt sustainment balances, forcing a defended power to make hard choices about what to protect and what to accept as exposed. Technically, the operation highlighted several innovations. First, the integration of electronic warfare and cyber-informed targeting allowed Ukrainian planners to synchronize physical effects with information degradation. When jamming rose, the drones pivoted to autonomous guidance. When radars tracked decoys, strike assets exploited the shifted attention. Second, the operational use of low-cost UAVs as force multipliers, both as attrition tools and as the vector for intelligence collection, signaled a doctrinal shift. Unmanned systems were no longer mere reconnaissance toys or tactical munition carriers. They were orchestrated nodes in a larger system of systems approach. Third, the attack underscored the increasing irrelevance of monopoly over high-end hardware in the face of networked, distributed lethality. You could be surrounded by S-400s and still be vulnerable if your sensor shooter links were probed and exploited at scale. The geopolitical echoes were immediate. For Moscow, the operation was a humiliation and a test. A humiliation because a territory the Kremlin presented as secured had been penetrated. A test because the response calculus from here on would need to balance force protection, deterrence signaling, and the political costs of escalatory countermeasures. For Kyiv, the operation was both a tactical win and a strategic demonstration. Proof that ingenuity and adaptation could deliver strategic shocks even in a war of attrition. International observers began to reevaluate bleeding-edge defense asymmetries. Defense journals ran pieces about the future of air defense. Think tanks organized emergency seminars to assess how to harden logistics and depots against similar swarm-enabled attacks. There were, of course, debates and caveats. Some analysts warned against romanticizing the attack as a one-off miracle. Sustainment matters. Maintaining these sophisticated strike drones, securing supply lines, and protecting command networks are all enduring challenges. Moreover, there were questions about collateral risk. A major fuel depot ablaze is an environmental disaster. Waterways, air quality, and civilian livelihoods were all imperiled. Ethical debates emerged about targeting infrastructure that inevitably affects civilians, even when such infrastructure has a clear military utility. The legal and normative dimensions of such operations would be argued in policy circles for months. Operationally, the night forced immediate adjustments. Russian air defense doctrine, which had privileged fixed-point protection and layered interceptors, faced an urgent question: how to detect and defeat low-altitude, inertially guided strike elements that deliberately skirt the contours of conventional radar coverage. Proposals included dispersing fuel stocks, hardening critical nodes, accelerating active protection systems, and investing in persistent aerial surveillance to spot launch preparation. But each mitigation brought costs and trade-offs. Dispersal reduces vulnerability but complicates logistics. Hardening is expensive. Persistent patrols require resources and overflight permissions that are not always available. For Ukrainian planners, the success offered both validation and responsibility. A validated method becomes a doctrine, and a doctrine invites countermeasures. Ukraine now had to think about operational security, protecting the new tactics from being reverse-engineered or anticipated. It had to ensure the industrial base and supply for its drone fleets could be maintained, and it had to consider escalation dynamics. Would repeated strikes on deep logistical nodes push Moscow toward riskier reprisals or negotiation? These were calculations not only of warfighting, but of statecraft. Beyond militaries, the strike reshaped narratives. International audiences saw footage that complicated simplistic assumptions. High-end weaponry does not guarantee impunity. Asymmetry, when well executed, can produce outsized strategic results. For content creators and media outlets, the images provided a visceral hook. Flames towering into black sky, trains halted in smashed yards, dock workers fleeing plumes of toxic smoke. Yet the imagery also demanded nuance, and responsible reporting sought to weave technical explanation with human stories to avoid turning a complex operation into mere spectacle. In the months that followed October 17th, analysts would comb through open-source data, geolocated imagery, and signal intercepts to construct a fuller narrative of what had happened and why it had mattered. Lessons distilled would include the primacy of intelligence-driven operations, the cost efficiency of distributed unmanned assets, and the increasing centrality of information, not just as propaganda, but as a force multiplier in shaping operational outcomes. Military schools would extract case studies. Procurement boards would reassess budgets. Allied nations would discuss collaborative efforts to harden critical nodes that were now exposed to cheap, effective attack vectors. The attack also provoked larger questions about the future of deterrence and defense. If a county can be made vulnerable not by brute force but by systemic targeting of logistics and sustainment, then national security architectures must evolve. This implies broader investments in redundancy, resilience, and distributed systems, from fuel caches that are harder to target to rail and convoy systems that can better absorb shocks. It also implies renewed thinking about civil defense and civilian military coordination in protecting essential services under siege-like conditions. Ultimately, the night of October 17, 2025, was not just a tactical lesson or a single headline. It was a demonstration of a shifting operational logic, one where cheapness, information, and coordination can yield strategic outcomes that tradition-bound militaries must reckon with. It reminded the world that technology alone does not win wars. The imagination to use that technology, the intelligence to orchestrate effects, and the courage to risk novel approaches in the teeth of a superior adversary do. The flames that lit the Crimean night were therefore both destruction and pedagogy. They destroyed infrastructure, but also taught a generation of strategists, commanders, and policymakers a new truth about the modern battlefield. For viewers, the images and analysis demand more than passive consumption. They demand a conversation about how wars are waged in the 21st century, how civilians are protected, and how states prepare not just to fight, but to sustain themselves under sustained pressure. The operation on October 17th will be studied as a model of asymmetric effect, and its reverberations will influence doctrine, procurement, and politics for years to come. In that sense, the night did more than scorch tanks and rails. It etched a new outline on the map of military possibility, one that will define thinking about conflict long after the fires have been extinguished.